Greetings. I'm Maria Carreira, the new Executive Director of the AATSP. Some of you might have seen our new NSE page, and if you have, I think you'll agree with me that it's absolutely gorgeous. It is the work of our very talented staff member, Lisa Berry. In this presentation, I want to focus on the NSA, the National Spanish Assessment. And I want to tell you about these particular features that are highlighted on our webpage and connect them to the whole idea of using the NSA for formative assessment. When thinking about assessment, it's useful to think of it in terms of the three parts mentioned here. Diagnostic assessment, which is pre-instruction, and is typically used for placement purposes. Summative assessment is at the other end, post-instruction, and formative assessment happens during instruction. In this presentation, I'm not going to focus on diagnostic assessment. What I really want to do is compare and contrast formative assessment, which has been called assessment for learning, to summative assessment, which has been called assessment of learning. So here's a chart that compares the two different types of assessment. You will notice that right above formative assessment, I have written NSA. And that's because I want to call attention to the formative value of the NSA. So in terms of purpose, the NSA can be used very well to improve instruction and provide feedback to students. Notice that that's not what happened with summative assessment, which comes at the end of instruction, and it's typically used to assign a grade. Looking now at when formative assessment is administered and comparing it to the same question as summative assessment, we see that it is administered throughout the instructional process, as opposed to summative assessment, which comes at the end. Now, here is a connection to the NSA. As you know, you can give it up to 3 times a year. So maybe at the beginning of the school year to set a baseline, and then 2 other times to track student progress. In terms of how teachers use it, well, you may recall that I said that formative assessment is assessment for learning. So teachers can use it to check for understanding how well their students have understood what has been taught in class, and to adapt their teaching to ensure better results. I mentioned tracking student progress. The NSA also lends itself to doing that very well, both at the class level by teachers, as well as at the school level by programs. Finally, let's turn to how students can use the NSA in a formative way. This involves using the NSA for students to self-monitor their understanding and to identify gaps in their understanding and strengths, and with the help of a teacher, to create a map of learning or a roadmap of learning. So let's look at how we can do that. As you know, the NSA has 4 modules that can be given at different times. They can be given separately. In this presentation, I'm going to give you examples from the listening comprehension of the test, as well as the vocabulary part of the test. I don't have time to go into the other 2 modules, reading and grammar, but I will hint at how to use some of this in the same way. So let me start with listening. And here I want to call attention to the very first line of the instructional value piece. And the first line, this line calls attention to the fact that reading and listening are aligned with the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. How does this help? Well, I normally teach my students about the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, because I find that this makes them autonomous learners and it provides a roadmap to learning. Notice that, I don't have time to go into this, but notice that, as you know, ACTFL has levels as well as sublevels. And if you compare the sublevels to each other, you can start to see how to get from one level to another. So by introducing the ACTFL proficiency guidelines and having students think about how they did and what is coming next, students can level up. This happens essentially by answering 3 questions or getting them to answer 3 questions. Where am I now? So how did I perform on this round of the test? Where am I going? So where can I go next? How do I level up? And then finally, how can I get there? Let's have a look more closely as to how we can do this. One of my favorite activities is to use the samples that the ACTFL proficiency guidelines give. Here, students can listen to a listening test at the novice level, and they can test themselves, and they can also read the rationale as to why this is a novice level listening task. This is very helpful because it teaches students that words like novice, intermediate, advanced mean something, and they are made up of components of language that can be targeted one by one in a systematic way. All of this makes for autonomous learning on the part of students, which is certainly something we all want. Let me now turn to vocabulary. This is what your grade book might look like. And you will notice that on the right, I have circled the word export because you can export this into an Excel sheet. Now, these categories are very tiny, so I am going to blow up one of them. And you can see that vocabulary is broken up into categories, the first one being geografía, and the last one in this set being biología. If we look at the grades at any one giving of the test or sitting of the test, the results can help students understand where they are. Remember, that's a critical first step to learning, but it's not enough. Students need to understand where they are going. And to illustrate how this can be done, I'm going to arbitrarily choose the category of geografía and also call attention to the multiple levels feature of the NSA, which, as you can see, refers to the fact that the NSA offers 7 levels of assessment and or instruction. So if I click on vocabulary, you can see those are your 7 levels there. And let's say my students are at level 1. Now, leveling up obviously means moving to level 2. Well, this is a great feature of our beautiful new website. We have vocabulary practice divided by levels. So if I scroll through this document, I will find a listing of vocabulary words in the category of geografía. It's a longer list. But notice now that students can say, in order to get to level 2, I better familiarize myself with the words in the geografía section that are at level 2. So notice what this booklet does. It helps students see where they're going. They've looked at the test, they know they're at level 1, they looked at the results, they know that they're at level 1, and now you want them to level up to level 2, and you want to help them by saying, hey, that's the end point. You should study those words. But that, of course, is not enough. Students need to understand how to get to that next level. In other words, how to close the gap. There's a lot of research that has been done on how to teach and learn vocabulary. Here, I'm just going to point out a few strategies that we know work really well. First of all, with vocabulary, we know that repeated exposure is of the essence. Sometimes it takes as many as 17 exposures to a word to learn its meaning and to be able to use it productively. Not all words take that long, right? Now, exposure is particularly good if it's spaced. So if it doesn't just happen over one day or even 1 week, when you keep coming back over it at intervals. Exposure should also be incidental, meaning it just happens by chance. You're reading another reading and all of a sudden there's a word that you learned in the previous unit. You go, oh, look at that, right? As well as purposeful. And I'm going to show you some activity shortly about that. It's best done not from a list, but in context, preferably real world context. Not in isolation, which is what happens with a list, but in clusters. And I will show you what I mean by that shortly. And then you typically want to move students from receptive, what they understand if they hear it or read it, to productive, being able to use in conversation and or in writing. So let's have a look at those activities I alluded to. I do this with my students and it's a fantastic activity. This is a chart I create where I represent different ways of knowing or not knowing a vocabulary item. Students tend to think of vocabulary as an either or type of thing. I either know it or I don't know it. But it turns out that it's not like that. If you look on the left, it turns out that when learning Spanish vocabulary or vocabulary in any other language, there might be words that you don't even know in English. So seeing the translation, look at the example for istmo, seeing the translation doesn't really help, because if you don't know the concept and the word in English, it's not going to help to learn it in Spanish. So these are words that are best learned in English and Spanish at the same time, and teaching the concept at the same time. On the other hand, students may have words that they don't know in Spanish, but they're perfectly familiar with in English, like hola, wave, of course. And notice that it's not just knowing that hola, as in the ocean, translates into wave, but that there are two holas in Spanish. They know how to spell hola without an H, meaning the ocean wave, and hola with an H, meaning hello. Moving to the right, higher level of knowledge is some students will understand the word if they hear it or if they read it, but they will not use it productively. Here's an example I just made up. Oeste, my guess is this is a hard word to use because oeste just sounds weird and it looks weird. You have those two vowels together at the beginning of a word. Finally, on the right, we have an understanding where students can use this word productively in speaking and in writing, for example. So notice that this is very purposeful learning, and it breaks up what it means to know a vocabulary into very useful categories. There are other useful categories, by the way. For instance, do I know how to spell it or not, right? And notice it moves from receptive to productive knowledge. So this is a very good exercise. Let's look at another exercise, and this has to do with having words not in isolation, but in clusters. We know that the word frontera typically is used with a number of verbs, for example, cruzar. So it's a good idea to learn frontera and the verbs that are commonly used with it. Cruzar la frontera. Same thing with mar, might be good to bring in navegar or nadar, por ejemplo. Montaña, escalar. The point is that rather than learning words in isolation, you want to get students to start thinking about what verbs, adjectives, prepositions come with the words that they're learning. Here's another type of clustering by morphology of shared roots. I know you've all done this exercise because it's a great exercise. So the words on the column, pueblo, habitante, agua, región, come from that booklet I showed you. So they're words that students have to know in order to level up to level 2. I, as a teacher, can create the words at the bottom of this chart and ask students to put them in the right category. This is a great activity for two reasons. One, because in learning Pueblo, there's no reason why students can't learn all the related words, población, poblar, even despoblar, if your students are more advanced academically. And two, because it helps students learn what a noun, or practice what a noun is, distinguishing it from what a verb is, distinguishing it from what an adjective is. So it helps them organize the elements of grammar that they will learn or are learning with you. Here's another activity. I love this activity. I have my students go online and copy real world sentences that are online. Here's an example using el mar, which is on the vocabulary list under geografía. El mar es un lugar mágico en el que puedes encontrar la paz y la tranquilidad. And here's one that uses frontera. España comparte frontera con Portugal, Francia y Andorra. Now, I've written these to look like they've been handwritten because I asked my students to actually write them out using paper and a pen or a pencil. Imagine that. No copying and pasting, because in the act of writing it out, there's a lot of incidental and purposeful learning going on. Now, once they have this, once they've done this, I say, well, let's take the first part of the sentence. El mar es un lugar, and now you fill it in. So notice we're going from passive use of language to productive use of language. I might say myself, el mar es un lugar maravilloso, pero también muy peligroso. There's a great sentence, and it sure beats the kind of sentences that our students tend to give us, which don't really inform the meaning of the word. Typically, you get, el mar es bonito. Doesn't work. Now, looking at the second sentence, the sentence frame might be, México comparte frontera con. Now, our students can go online and find out where the answer to this question. And they can keep going. They can go to Guatemala, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, etc. Notice this kind of activity, all of these activities take students from receptive, you're copying a sentence, you're copying población, to productive knowledge. You're doing something with it. It takes them in, it moves them into using words in context, in clusters, not just from a list. And it creates opportunities for incidental as well as purposeful learning. Here's the final activity, the hardest of them all, but surely the funnest. Students can create a Jeopardy competition. And they can take the vocabulary. You can help them form questions. ¿En qué continente se encuentran las montañas más altas del mundo? Notice now they're practicing montaña, but not just in the singular, in the plural. And they're practicing writing questions. They're putting it in a question, right? And they're using se encuentran. Notice there's a lot of grammar that you're reviewing here. If your students can't say se encuentran, ¿en qué continente están las montañas más altas del mundo? And there are two other questions that also would give students the opportunity to practice the vocabulary that they learn in geography. ¿Cuál es el punto más profundo del mundo? Que se encuentra, por supuesto, en la profundidad del mar. ¿Y cuál es la ciudad más poblada del mundo? Que se relaciona a la palabra pueblo, que aprendimos anteriormente. Notice this is a way to teach students real world knowledge as you're also teaching Spanish. It's also a way to create competition, healthy, fun competition between students. I mentioned earlier that teachers and programs can track student growth, that's a very good feature of the NSA. I want to point out that students can track their own growth. They can track the scores that they got on the different takings of the NSA. as well as in a portfolio, keep track of all the activities that they have been doing to level up. This is a very useful exercise from the point of view of becoming an informed learner and an autonomous learner. One last thing I want to point out is that under instructional value, the second sentence, which I didn't read to you earlier, points out that the NSA can be used as a stepping stone to the NSC or other exams such as the CLEP, the AP, and STAMP. The CLEP, the AP, and STAMP are high stakes exams, right? Because they're kind of summative. They tell you where students are at the end of instruction, and they're high stakes in the sense that they're also very expensive. The NSC, which costs $4 and you can give 3 times, can help prepare these students for those high stakes exams. I hope this video has been useful to you. I look forward to learning from you, and I invite you to send us a short video with your ideas about how to use the NSA. We will post your video during National Teach Spanish Week. Thank you.